Food of the Gods, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge, A Radical History of Plants, Drugs, and Human Evolution, by Terence Mckenna. Narrated by Jeffrey Kafer. Copyright 1992 by Terence McKenna. This unabridged audiobook is recorded by arrangement with Lux Natura and Brockman Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. A manifesto for new thought about drugs. A specter is haunting planetary culture. The specter of drugs. The definition of human dignity created by the Renaissance and elaborated into the democratic values of modern Western civilization seems on point of dissolving. The major media inform us at high volume that the human capacity for obsessional behavior and addiction has made a satanic marriage with modern pharmacology, marketing, and high-speed transportation. Previously obscure forms of chemical use now freely compete in a largely unregulated global marketplace. Whole governments and nations in the Third World are held in thrall by legal and illegal commodities promoting obsessional behavior. This situation is not new, but it is getting worse. Until quite recently, international narcotics cartels were the obedient creations of governments and intelligence agencies that were searching for sources of invisible money with which to finance their own brand of institutionalized obsessional behavior. Today, these drug cartels have evolved, through the unprecedented rise in the demand for cocaine, into rogue elephants before whose power even their creators have begun to grow uneasy. We are beset by the sad spectacle of drug wars, waged by governmental institutions that usually are paralyzed by lethargy and inefficiency, or are in transparent collusion with the international drug cartels they are publicly pledged to destroy. No light can penetrate this situation of pandemic drug use and abuse unless we undertake a hard-eyed reappraisal of our present situation and an examination of some old, nearly forgotten patterns of drug-related experience and behavior. The importance of this task cannot be overestimated. Clearly, the self-administration of psychoactive substances, legal and illegal, will be increasingly a part of the future unfolding of global culture. An agonizing reappraisal. Any reappraisal of our use of substances must begin with the notion of habit, a settled tendency or practice. Familiar, repetitious, and largely unexamined habits are simply the things that we do. People, says an old adage, are creatures of habit. Culture is largely a matter of habit, learned from parents and those around us, and then slowly modified by shifting conditions and inspired innovations. Yet, however slow these cultural modifications may seem, when contrasted with a slower-than-glaciers modification of species and ecosystems, culture presents a spectacle of wild and continuous novelty. If nature represents a principle of economy, then culture surely must exemplify the principle of innovation through excess. When habits consume us, when our devotion to them exceeds the culturally defined norms, we label them as obsessions. We feel in such situations as though the uniquely human dimension of free will has somehow been violated. We can become obsessed with almost anything, with a behavior pattern such as reading the morning paper, or with material objects, the collector, land and property, the empire builder, or power over other people, the politician. While many of us may be collectors, few of us have the opportunity to indulge our obsessions to the point of becoming empire builders or politicians. The obsessions of the ordinary person tend to focus on the here and now, on the realm of immediate gratification through sex, food, and drugs. An obsession with the chemical constituents of food and drugs, also called metabolites, is labeled an addiction. Addictions and obsessions are unique to human beings. Yes, ample anecdotal evidence supports the existence of a preference for intoxicated states among elephants, chimpanzees, and some butterflies. But as when we contrast the linguistic abilities of chimpanzees and dolphins with human speech, we see that these animal behaviors are enormously different from those of humans. Habit, obsession, addiction. These words are signposts along a path of ever-decreasing free will. Denial of the power of free will is implicit in the notion of addiction, and in our culture, addictions are viewed seriously. especially exotic or unfamiliar addictions. In the 19th century, the opium addict was the opium fiend, a description that harkened back to the idea of a demonic possession by a controlling force from without. In the 20th century, the addict as a person possessed has been replaced with the notion of addiction as a disease. And with the notion of addiction as a disease, the role of free will is finally reduced to the vanishing point. After all, we are not responsible for the diseases that we may inherit or develop. Today, however, human chemical dependence plays a more conscious role than ever before in the formation and maintenance of cultural values. Since the middle of the 19th century, and with ever greater speed and efficiency, organic chemistry has placed into the hands of researchers, physicians, and ultimately everyone an endless cornucopia of synthetic drugs. These drugs are more powerful, more effective, of greater duration, and in some cases, many times more addictive than their natural relatives. An exception is cocaine, although a natural product, when refined, concentrated, and injected, is particularly destructive. The rise of a global information culture has led to the ubiquity of information on the recreational, aphrodisiacal, stimulating, sedative, and psychedelic plants that have been discovered by inquisitive human beings living in remote and previously unconnected parts of the planet. At the same time that this flood of botanical and ethnographic information arrived in Western society, grafting other cultures' habits onto our own and giving us greater choices than ever, great strides were being made in the synthesis of complex organic molecules and in the understanding of the molecular machinery of genes and heredity. These new insights and technologies are contributing to a very different culture of psychopharmacological engineering. Designer drugs such as MDMA or ecstasy and anabolic steroids used by athletes and teenagers to stimulate muscle development are harbingers of an era of ever more frequent and effective pharmacological intervention in how we look, perform, and feel. The notion of regulating on a planetary scale, first hundreds and then thousands of easily produced, highly sought-after, but illegal synthetic substances is appalling to anyone who hopes for a more open and less regimented future. An Archaic Revival. This book will explore the possibility of a revival of the archaic, or pre-industrial and pre-literate attitude toward community, substance use, and nature, an attitude that served our nomadic prehistoric ancestors long and well, before the rise of the current cultural style we call Western. The archaic refers to the Upper Paleolithic, a period 7,000 to 10,000 years in the past, immediately preceding the invention and dissemination of agriculture. The archaic was a time of nomadic pastoralism and partnership, a culture based on cattle raising, shamanism, and goddess worship. I have organized the discussion in a roughly chronological order, with the last and most future-oriented sections taking up and recasting the archaic themes of the early chapters. The argument proceeds along the lines of a pharmacological pilgrim's progress. Thus I have called the 4 sections of the book Paradise, Paradise Lost, Hell, and hopefully not too optimistically, Paradise Regained. Obviously, we cannot continue to think about drug use in the same old ways. As a global society, we must find a new guiding image for our culture, one that unifies the aspirations of humanity with the needs of the planet and the individual. Analysis of the existential incompleteness within us that drives us to form relationships of dependency and addiction with plants and drugs will show that at the dawn of history, we lost something precious, the absence of which has made us ill with narcissism. Only a recovery of the relationship that we evolved with nature through use of psychoactive plants before the fall into history can offer us hope of a humane and open-ended future. Before we commit ourselves irrevocably to the chimera of a drug-free culture purchased at the price of a complete jettisoning of the ideals of a free and democratic planetary society, we must ask hard questions. Why, as a species, are we so fascinated by altered states of consciousness? What has been their impact on our aesthetic and spiritual aspirations? What have we lost by denying the legitimacy of each individual's drive to use substances to experience personally the transcendental and the sacred? My hope is that answering these questions will force us to confront the consequences of denying nature's spiritual dimension, of seeing nature as nothing more than a resource to be fought over and plundered. Informed discussion of these issues will give no comfort to the control-obsessed, no comfort to know-nothing religious fundamentalism, no comfort to beige fascism of whatever form. The question of how we, as a society and as individuals, relate to psychoactive plants in the late 20th century raises a larger question. How over time have we been shaped by the shifting alliances that we have formed and broken with various members of the vegetable world as we have made our way through the maze of history? This is a question that will occupy us in some detail in the chapters to come. The myth of our culture opens in the Garden of Eden, with the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. If we do not learn from our past, this story could end with a planet toxified, its forests a memory, its biological cohesion shattered, our birth legacy a weed-choked wasteland. If we have overlooked something in our previous attempts to understand our origins and place in nature, are we now in a position to look back and to understand not only our past but our future in an entirely new way? If we can recover the lost sense of nature as a living mystery, we can be confident of new perspectives on the cultural adventure that surely must lie ahead. We have the opportunity to move away from the gloomy, historical nihilism that characterizes the reign of our deeply patriarchal dominator culture. We are in a position to regain the archaic appreciation of our near symbiotic relationship with psychoactive plants as a wellspring of insight and coordination flowing from the vegetable world to the human world. The mystery of our own consciousness and powers of self-reflection is somehow linked to this channel of communication with the unseen mind that shamans insist is the spirit of the living world of nature. For shamans and shamanic cultures, exploration of this mystery has always been a credible alternative to living in a confining materialist culture. We of the individual democracies can choose to explore these unfamiliar dimensions now, or we can wait until the advancing destruction of the living planet makes all further exploration irrelevant. A new manifesto. The time has therefore come, in the great natural discourse that is the history of ideas, thoroughly to rethink our fascination with habitual use of psychoactive and physioactive plants. We have to learn from the excesses of the past, especially the 1960s, but we cannot simply advocate just say no any more than we can advocate try it, you'll like it. Nor can we support a view that wishes to divide society into users and non-users. We need a comprehensive approach to these questions that encompass the deeper evolutionary and historical implications. The mutation-inducing influence of diet on early humans and the effect of exotic metabolites on the evolution of their neurochemistry and culture is still unstudied territory. The early hominids' adoption of an omnivorous diet and their discovery of the power of certain plants were decisive factors in moving early humans out of the stream of animal evolution and into the fast-rising tide of language and culture. Our remote ancestors discovered that certain plants, when self-administered, suppress appetite, diminish pain, supply bursts of sudden energy, confer immunity against pathogens, and synergize cognitive activities. These discoveries set us on the long journey of self-reflection. Once we became tool-using omnivores, evolution itself changed from a process of slow modification of our physical form to a rapid definition of cultural forms by the elaboration of rituals, languages, writing, mnemonic skills, and technology. These immense changes occurred largely as a result of the synergies between human beings and the various plants with which they interacted and co-evolved. An honest appraisal of the impact of plants on the foundations of human institutions would find them to be absolutely primary. In the future, the application of botanically inspired steady-state solutions, such as zero population growth, hydrogen extraction from seawater, and massive recycling programs, may help reorganize our societies and planet along more holistic, environmentally aware, neo-archaic lines. The suppression of the natural human fascination with altered states of consciousness and the present perilous situation of all life on Earth are intimately and causally connected. When we suppress access to shamanic ecstasy, we close off the refreshing waters of emotion that flow from having a deeply bonded, almost symbiotic relationship to the Earth. As a consequence, the maladaptive social styles that encourage overpopulation, resource mismanagement, and environmental toxification develop and maintain themselves. No culture on Earth is as heavily narcotized as the industrial West in terms of being inured to the consequences of maladaptive behavior. We pursue a business-as-usual attitude in a surreal atmosphere of mounting crises and irreconcilable contradictions. As a species, we need to acknowledge the depth of our historical dilemma. We will continue to play with half a deck as long as we continue to tolerate cardinals of government and science who presume to dictate where human curiosity can legitimately focus its attention and where it cannot. Such restrictions on the human imagination are demeaning and preposterous. The government not only restricts research on psychedelics that could conceivably yield valuable psychological and medical insights, it presumes to prevent their religious and spiritual use as well. Religious use of psychedelic plants is a civil rights issue. Its restriction is the repression of a legitimate religious sensibility. In fact, it is not a religious sensibility that is being repressed, but the religious sensibility, an experience of religio based on the plant-human relationships that were in place long before the advent of history. We can no longer postpone an honest reappraisal of the true cost and benefits of habitual use of plants and drugs versus the true costs and benefits of suppression of their use. Our global culture finds itself in danger of succumbing to an Orwellian effort to bludgeon the problem out of existence through military and police terrorism directed toward drug consumers in our own population and drug producers in the Third World. This repressive response is largely fueled by an unexamined fear that is the product of misinformation and historical ignorance. Deep-seated cultural biases explain why the Western mind turns suddenly anxious and repressive on contemplating drugs. Substance-induced changes in consciousness dramatically reveal that our mental life has physical foundations. Psychoactive drugs thus challenge the Christian assumption of the inviolability and special ontological status of the soul. Similarly, they challenge the modern idea of the ego and its inviolability and control structures. In short, encounters with psychedelic plants throw into question the entire worldview of the dominator culture. We will come across this theme of the ego and the dominator culture often in this re-examination of history. In fact, the terror the ego feels in contemplating the dissolution of boundaries between self and world not only lies behind the suppression of altered states of consciousness, but more generally explains the suppression of the feminine, the foreign and exotic, and transcendental experiences. In the prehistoric but post-archaic times of about 5000 to 3000 BC, suppression of partnership society by patriarchal invaders set the stage for suppression of the open-ended experimental investigation of nature carried on by shamans. In highly organized societies, that archaic tradition was replaced by one of dogma, priestcraft, patriarchy, warfare, and eventually, rational and scientific or dominator values. To this point, I have used the terms partnership and dominator styles of culture without explanation. I owe these useful terms to Riane Eisler and her important revisioning of history, The Chalice and the Blade. Eisler has advanced the notion that partnership models of society preceded and later competed with and were oppressed by dominator forms of social organization. Dominator cultures are hierarchical, paternalistic, materialistic, and male-dominated. Eisler believes that the tension between the partnership and dominator organizations and the overexpression of the dominator model are responsible for our alienation from nature, from ourselves, and from each other. Eisler has written a brilliant synthesis of the emergence of human culture in the ancient Near East and the unfolding political debate concerning the feminizing of culture and the need to overcome patterns of male dominance in creating a viable future. Her analysis of gender politics raises the level of debate beyond those who have so shrilly hailed and decried this or that ancient matriarchy or patriarchy. The Chalice and the Blade introduces the notion of partnership societies and dominator societies, and uses the archaeological record to argue that over vast areas and for many centuries, the partnership societies of the ancient Middle East were without warfare and upheaval. Warfare and patriarchy arrived with the appearance of dominator values. The dominator inheritance. Our culture, self-toxified by the poisonous byproducts of technology and egocentric ideology, is the unhappy inheritor of the dominator attitude, that alteration of consciousness by the use of plants or substances is somehow wrong, onanistic, and perversely antisocial. I will argue that suppression of shamanic gnosis, with its reliance and insistence on ecstatic dissolution of the ego, has robbed us of life's meaning and made us enemies of the planet, of ourselves, and our grandchildren. We are killing the planet in order to keep intact the wrong-headed assumptions of the ego-dominator cultural style. It is time for change. Part 1. Paradise. Chapter 1. Shamanism. Setting the stage. Ryangi sat still in the fading light of the fire. He felt his body flex deep within in ways that reminded him of the gulping of an eel. As he formed his thought, an eel's head, oversized and bathed in electric blue, appeared obediently in the darkened space behind his eyelids. Mother Spirit of the first waterfall. Grandmother of the first rivers. Show yourself, show yourself. Responding to the voices, the darkened space behind the now slowly spinning eel apparition filled with sparks. Waves of light leaped higher and higher, accompanied by a roar of increasing intensity. It is the first Maria. The voice is that of Manji, the elder shaman of the village Jarakamina. It is strong, so strong. Manji is silent as the visions close over them. They are on the brink of Venturi, the real world, the blue zone. The sound of falling rain outside is unrecognizable. There is a shuffling of dry leaves mingled with the sound of distant bells. Their tingling seems more like light than sound. Until relatively recently, the practices of Manji and her remote Amazonian tribe were typical of religious practice everywhere. Only in the last several millennia have theology and ritual graduated to more elaborate and not necessarily more serviceable forms. Shamanism and ordinary religion. When I arrived in the Upper Amazon in early 1970, I had just spent several years living in Asian societies. Asia is a place where the shattered shells of cast-off religious ontologies litter the dusty landscape like the carapaces of sand-scoured scarabs. I had traveled India in search of the miraculous. I had visited its temples and ashrams, its jungles and mountain retreats. But yoga, a lifetime calling, the obsession of a disciplined and ascetic few, was not sufficient to carry me to the inner landscapes that I sought. I learned in India that religion, in all times and places where the luminous flame of the spirit has guttered low, is no more than a hustle. Religion in India stares from world-weary eyes familiar with 4 millennia of priestcraft. Modern Hindu India to me was both an antithesis and a fitting prelude to the nearly archaic shamanism that I found in the lower Rio Putumayo of Colombia when I arrived there to begin studying the shamanic use of hallucinogenic plants. Shamanism is the practice of the Upper Paleolithic tradition of healing, divination, and theatrical performance based on natural magic developed 10 to 50,000 years ago. Mircea Eliade, author of Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, and the foremost authority on shamanism in the context of comparative religion, has shown that in all times and places, shamanism maintains a surprisingly internal coherency of practice and belief. Whether the shaman is an Arctic-dwelling Inuit or a Watoto of the Upper Amazon, certain techniques and expectations remain the same. Most important of these invariants is ecstasy, a point my brother and I make in our book, The Invisible Landscape. The ecstatic part of the shaman's initiation is harder to analyze, for it is dependent on a certain receptivity to states of trance and ecstasy on the part of the novice. He may be moody, somewhat frail and sickly, predisposed to solitude, and may perhaps have fits of epilepsy or catatonia, or some other psychological aberrance, though not always as some writers on the subject have asserted. In any case, his psychological predisposition to ecstasy forms only the starting point for his initiation. The novice, after a history of psychosomatic illness or psychological aberration that may be more or less intense, will at last begin to undergo initiatory sickness and trances. He will lie as though dead or in deep trance for days on end. During this time he is approached in dreams by his helping spirits and may receive instruction from them. Invariably, during this prolonged trance, the novice will undergo an episode of mystical death and resurrection. He may see himself reduced to a skeleton and then clothed with new flesh. Or he may see himself boiled in a cauldron, devoured by the spirits, and then made whole again. Or he may imagine himself being operated on by the spirits, his organs removed and replaced with magical stones, and then sewn up again. Eliade showed that, while the particular motifs may vary between cultures and even individuals, shamanism's general structure is clear. The neophyte shaman undergoes a symbolic death and resurrection, which is understood as a radical transformation into a superhuman condition. Henceforth, the shaman has access to the superhuman plane, is a master of ecstasy, can travel in the spirit realm at will, and most important, can cure and divine. As we noted in The Invisible Landscape, in short, the shaman is transformed from a profane into a sacred state of being. Not only has he effected his own cure through this mystical transmutation, he is now invested with the power of the sacred, and hence can cure others as well. It is of the first order of importance to remember this, that the shaman is more than merely a sick man or a madman. He is a sick man who has healed himself, who is cured, and who must shamanize in order to remain cured. It should be noted that Eliade used the word profane deliberately with the intent of creating a clear split between the notion of the profane world of ordinary experience and the sacred world, which is wholly other. The techniques of ecstasy. Not all shamans use intoxication with plants to obtain ecstasy, but all shamanic practice aims to give rise to ecstasy. Drumming, manipulation of breath, ordeals, fasting, theatrical illusions, sexual abstinence, all are time-honored methods for entering into the trance necessary for shamanic work. Yet none of these methods is as effective, as ancient, and as overwhelming as the use of plants containing chemical compounds that produce visions. This practice of using visionary plant intoxicants may seem alien or surprising to some Westerners. Our society regards psychoactive drugs as either frivolous or dangerous, at best reserved for the treatment of the seriously mentally ill, where no other effective method is available. We retain the notion of the healer in the figure of the medical professional who, through the possession of special knowledge, can cure. But the specialized knowledge of the modern physician is clinical knowledge, removed from the unfolding drama of each unique and particular person. Shamanism is different. Usually if drugs are used, the shaman, not the patient, will take the drug. The motivation is also entirely different. The plants used by the shaman are not intended to stimulate the immune system or the body's other natural defenses against disease. Rather, the shamanic plants allow the healer to journey into an invisible realm in which the causality of the ordinary world is replaced with the rationale of natural magic. In this realm, language, ideas, and meaning have greater power than cause and effect. Sympathies, resonances, intentions, and personal will are linguistically magnified through poetic rhetoric. The imagination is invoked, and sometimes its forms are beheld visibly. Within the magical mindset of the shaman, the ordinary connections of the world and what we call natural laws are de-emphasized or ignored. A world made of language. The evidence gathered from millennia of shamanic experience argues that the world is actually made of language in some fashion. Although at odds with the expectations of modern science, this radical proposition is in agreement with much of the current linguistic thinking. The 20th century linguistic revolution, says Boston University anthropologist Misha Landau, is the recognition that language is not merely a device for communicating ideas about the world, but rather a tool for bringing the world into existence in the first place. Reality is not simply experienced or reflected in language, but instead is actually produced by language. From the point of view of the psychedelic shaman, the world appears to be more in the nature of an utterance or a tale than in any way related to the leptons and baryons or charge and spin that our high priests, the physicists, speak of. For the shaman, the cosmos is a tale that becomes true as it is told and as it tells itself. This perspective implies that human imagination can seize the tiller of being in the world. Freedom, personal responsibility, and a humbling awareness of the true size and intelligence of the world combine in this point of view to make it a fitting basis for living an authentic neo-archaic life. A reverence for and an immersion in the powers of language and communication are the basis of the shamanic path. This is why the shaman is the remote ancestor of the poet and artist. Our need to feel part of the world seems to demand that we express ourselves through creative activity. The ultimate wellsprings of this creativity are hidden in the mystery of language. Shamanic ecstasy is an act of surrender that authenticates both the individual's self and that which is surrendered to, the mystery of being. Because our maps of reality are determined by our present circumstances, we tend to lose awareness of the larger patterns of time and space. Only by gaining access to the transcendent other can those patterns of time and space and our role in them be glimpsed. Shamanism strives for this higher point of view, which is achieved through a feat of linguistic prowess. A shaman is one who has attained a vision of the beginnings and the endings of all things, and who can communicate that vision. To the rational thinker, this is inconceivable, yet the techniques of shamanism are directed toward this end, and this is the source of their power. Preeminent among the shaman's techniques is the use of the plant hallucinogens, repositories of living vegetable gnosis that lie now nearly forgotten in our ancient past. Higher dimensional reality. By entering the domain of plant intelligence, the shaman becomes, in a way, privileged to a higher dimensional perspective on experience. Common sense assumes that, though languages are always evolving, the raw stuff of what language expresses is relatively constant and common to all humans. Yet we also know that the Hopi language has no past or future tenses or concepts. How then can the Hopi world be like ours? And the Inuit have no first-person pronoun. How then can their world be like ours? The grammars of languages, their internal rules, have been carefully studied. Yet too little attention has been devoted to examining how language creates and defines the limits of reality. Perhaps language is more properly understood when thought of as magic, for it is the implicit position of magic that the world is made of language. If language is accepted as the primary datum of knowing, then we in the West have been sadly misled. Only shamanic approaches will be able to give us answers to the questions we find most interesting. Who are we? Where did we come from? And toward what fate do we move? These questions have never been more important than today, when evidence of the failure of science to nurture the soul of humanity is everywhere around us. Ours is not merely temporary ennui of the spirit. If we are not careful, ours is a terminal condition of the collective body and spirit. The rational, mechanistic, anti-spiritual bias of our own culture has made it impossible for us to appreciate the mindset of the shaman. We are culturally and linguistically blind to the world of forces and interconnections clearly visible to those who have retained the archaic relationship to nature. Of course, when I arrived in the Amazon 20 years ago, I knew nothing of the preceding. Like most Westerners, I believed that magic was a phenomenon of the naive and the primitive, that science could provide an explanation for the workings of the world. In that position of intellectual naivete, I encountered psilocybin mushrooms for the first time, at San Agustin in the Alto Magdalena of southern Colombia. Later, and not far away in Florencia, I also encountered and used visionary brews made from Banisteriopsis vines, the yage or ayahuasca of 1960s underground legend. The experience that I had during those travels were personally transforming, and more important, they introduced me to a class of experiences that is vital to the restoration of balance in our social and environmental worlds. I have shared the group mind that is generated in the vision sessions of the ayahuasqueros. I have seen the magical darts of red light that one shaman can send against another. But more revelatory than the paranormal feats of gifted magicians and spiritual healers were the inner riches that I discovered within my own mind at the apex of these experiences. I offer my account as a kind of witness, in every man. If these experiences happen to me, then they can be part of the general experience of men and women everywhere. A shamanic meme. My shamanic education was not unique. Thousands of people have, by one means or another, come to the conclusion that psychedelic plants and the shamanic institutions that their use implies are profound tools for the exploration of the inner depths of the human psyche. Psychedelic shamans now constitute a worldwide and growing subculture of hyperdimensional explorers, many of whom are scientifically sophisticated. A landscape is coming into focus, a region still glimpsed only dimly, but emerging, claiming the attention of rational discourse, and possibly threatening to confound it. We may yet remember how to behave, how to take our correct place in the connecting pattern, the seamless web of all things. An understanding of how to achieve this balance lingers on in the forgotten and trampled cultures of the rainforests and deserts of the Third World, and in the reserves and reservations into which dominator cultures force their aboriginal people. The shamanic gnosis is possibly dying. Certainly it is changing. Yet the plant hallucinogens that are the source of this, the oldest of human religions, remain a clear running spring, as refreshing as they have always been. Shamanism is vital and real because of the individual encounter with the challenge and wonder, the ecstasy and exultation induced by hallucinogenic plants. My encounters with shamanism and hallucinogens in the Amazon convinced me of their salvific performance. Once convinced, I was determined to filter out the various forms of linguistic, cultural, pharmacological, and personal noise that obscured the mystery. I hoped to distill the essence of shamanism, to track the epiphany to her lair. I wanted to see beyond the veils of her whirling dance. A cosmic peeping Tom, I dreamed of confronting naked beauty. A cynic in the Dominator style might be content to dismiss this as delusions of romantic youth. Ironically, I was at one time that cynic. I felt the folly of the quest. I knew the odds. The other, naked platonic beauty? You must be kidding. And it must be admitted that there were many wild misadventures along the way. We must become God's fools, an enthusiastic Zen acquaintance once urged, by which he meant hit the road. Seeking and finding had been a method that had worked for me in the past. I knew that shamanic practices based on the use of hallucinogenic plants still survived in the Amazon, and I was determined to confirm my intuition that a great secret lay undiscovered behind this fact. Reality outran apprehension. The mottled face of the leprous old woman was made more startlingly hideous when the fire she tended suddenly flared as she added more wood. In the semi-darkness behind her, I could see the guide who had brought me to this unnamed place on the Rio Kumala. Back in the Rivertown bar, this chance encounter with a boatman willing to take me to see the miracle-working ayahuasca witch of local legend had seemed like a great chance for a story. Now, after 3 days of river travel and a half-day struggling through trails so flooded with mud that they threatened with each step to suck your boots right off you, I was not so sure. At this point, the original object of my quest, the authentic deep forest ayahuasca, reportedly so different from the swill of the charlatans of the marketplace, hardly held any interest for me. "Tome, caballero," the old woman had cackled as she offered me a full cup of the black, slow-flowing liquid. Its surface had the sheen of motor oil. She must have grown into this role, I thought as I drank. It was warm and salty, chalky and bittersweet. It tasted like the blood of some old thing. I tried not to think about how much at the mercy of these strange people I now was. But in fact my courage was failing. Both Doña Catalina and the guide's mocking eyes had slowly gone cold and mantis-like. A wave of insect sounds sweeping up the river seemed to splatter the darkness with shards of sharp-edged light. I felt my lips go numb. Trying not to appear as loaded as I felt, I crossed to my hammock and lay back. Behind my closed eyelids there was a flowing river of magenta light. It occurred to me in a kind of dreamy mental pirouette that a helicopter must be landing on top of the hut, and this was the last impression I had. When I regained consciousness, I appeared to myself to be surfing on the inner curl of a wave of brightly lit, transparent information several hundred feet high. Exhilaration gave way to terror as I realized that my wave was speeding toward a rocky coastline. Everything disappeared in the roaring chaos of informational wave meeting virtual land. More lost time and then an impression of being a shipwrecked sailor washed onto a tropical shore. I feel that I am pressing my face into the hot sand of a tropical beach. I feel lucky to be alive. I am lucky to be alive. Or is it that I am alive to be lucky? I break up laughing. At this point the old woman begins to sing. Hers is no ordinary song, but an ikaro, a magical curing song that in our intoxicated and ecstatic state seems more like a tropical reel fish or an animated silk scarf of many colors than a vocal performance. The song is a visible manifestation of power, enfolding us and making us secure. Shamanism and the Lost Archaic World. Shamanism was beautifully defined by Mircea Eliade as the archaic techniques of ecstasy. Eliade's use of the term archaic is important here because it alerts us to the role that shamanism must play in any authentic revival of vital archaic forms of being, living, and understanding. The shaman gains entrance into a world that is hidden from those who dwell in ordinary reality. In this other dimension lurk powers both helpful and malevolent. Its rules are not the rules of our world. They are more like the rules that operate in myth and dream. Shamanic healers insist on the existence of an intelligent other somewhere in a dimension nearby. The existence of an ecology of souls or a disincarnate intelligence is not something that science can be expected to grapple with and emerge with its own premises intact, particularly if this other has long been a part of the terrestrial ecology, present but unseen, a global secret sharer. The writings of Carlos Castaneda and his imitators have resulted in a fad of shamanic awareness, which, although muddled, has turned the shaman from a peripheral figure in the literature of cultural anthropology into the media role model for full membership in neo-archaic society. In spite of the grip that shamanism has on the popular imagination, the paranormal phenomena that it assumes to be actual and true have never been taken seriously by modern science, even if scientists, in a rare case of deference, have called on psychologists and anthropologists to analyze shamanism. This blindness to the paranormal world has created an intellectual blind spot in our normal worldview. We are completely unaware of the magical world of the shaman. It is quite simply stranger than we can suppose. Consider a shaman who uses plants to converse with an invisible world inhabited by non-human intelligences. This would seem to rate a headline in the supermarket tabloids. Yet anthropologists report such things all the time, and no one raises an eyebrow. That is because we tend to assume that the shaman interprets his experience of intoxication as communication with spirits or ancestors. The implication is that you or I would interpret the same experience differently, and that therefore it is no big deal that some poor, uneducated campesino thought he was talking with an angel. Xenophobic as this attitude is, it suggests a good operating procedure, since what it is saying is, show me the techniques of your ecstasy, and I will judge their effectiveness for myself. I did this. This is my credential for the theories and opinions I hold. I was initially appalled at what I found. The world of shamanism, of allies, shape-shifting, and magical attack are far more real than the constructs of science can ever be, because these spirit ancestors and their other world can be seen and felt. They can be known in the non-ordinary reality. Something profound, unexpected, nearly unimaginable awaits us if we will turn our investigative attentions toward the phenomenon of shamanic plant hallucinogens. The people outside of Western history, those still in the dream time of pre-literacy, have kept the flame of a tremendous mystery burning. It will be humbling to admit this and to learn from them, but that too is a part of the archaic revival. This is not to imply that we must stand slack-jawed before the accomplishments of the primitive and yet another version of the noble savage cha-cha. Everyone who has worked in the field is aware of the frequent clash between our expectations of how true rainforest people should behave and the realities of tribal daily life. No one yet understands the mysterious intelligence within plants, or the implications of the idea that nature communicates in a basic chemical language that is unconscious but profound. We do not yet understand how hallucinogens transform the message in the unconscious into revelations beheld by the conscious mind. As archaic people honed their intuitions and their senses by using whatever plants were at hand to increase their adaptive advantage, they had little time for philosophy. To this day, the implications of the existence of this mind within nature, discovered by shamanic peoples, have yet to fully dawn. Meanwhile, quietly and outside of history, shamanism has pursued its dialogue with an invisible world. Shamanism's legacy can act as a steadying force to redirect our awareness toward the collective fate of the biosphere. The shamanic faith is that humanity is not without allies. There are forces friendly to our struggle to birth ourselves as an intelligent species, but they are quiet and shy. They are to be sought not in the arrival of alien starfleets in the skies of Earth, but nearby, in wilderness solitude, in the ambiance of waterfalls, and yes, in the grasslands and pastures now too rarely beneath our feet.